Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at vectors and in general, more complicated things like structs in C++ and how we can access the individual parts to both set and get those from a struct. Let's dive in. So we've learnt how to deal with basic data types in C++ and create variables and assign to them and even do some basic arithmetic with them. But what about if we wanted to deal with more complicated types such as vectors and transforms? Well, the process is actually very similar. Let's start off by clearing out some of the test code that we've already got. I'm going to delete all of my U properties. For me, that's line 26 down to 51. And I'm also going to go over into the C++ file and delete lines 19 to 23, which is where I'm doing all of the work with those variables that I just deleted. So now begin play is completely empty, and we're back to essentially square one. So now what I want to do is add in a new U property, so all caps again, edit anywhere, and I'm going to give this the type of F vector. Notice the capitalization, capital F, capital V, and this is how we deal with the vectors that we've dealt with in Blueprint. They're the same vectors under the surface, but this is how we type it in C++. The F that precedes it just lets us know that this is a struct, in the same way as the A that precedes moving platform lets us know that that is an actor. That's not a C++ thing, that is an Unreal naming convention for naming the different classes, structs, and types. So then what we're going to do is give this variable a name, and this works exactly the same way as if it were a float or an int. We can call it my float, for example. It needs to have no spaces. And if we were to put a semicolon at the end of the line here, then that's it. We've declared a new variable that will be visible in our details pane over in the editor. But that's not enough for me. I would like to actually give this a default value that's different from the default 000. To do that, we need to update our glossary with a new term. We need a constructor, which is essentially something in C++ that makes a new struct or class value. So if we were to create a constructor for the vector, the way this would work is we want to assign a value. So we hit equals, and typically when we were dealing with integers or floats, we could just use something like a 1 or a true. There were built-in values that allowed us to set the value of those basic types. But when we have more elaborate types, like a struct, we need to use the constructor. And the constructor will always have the same name as the data type. So it will be f vector, spelled exactly the same. And then you open some parentheses, and inside the parentheses, you give the values that you want. So x, y, and z is what makes up a vector. So we could have 1, 2, and 3 all separated by commas, and then we close the parentheses and put a semicolon at the end of the line. And that will give a default value of 1, 2, and 3 in the x, y, and z for this vector. Let's try it out. Go back into Unreal and hit the compile button. And once that's completed successfully, we can make sure we've got the moving platform actor selected in our outliner, and have a look at the details pane and see that indeed we've got a new property called myFloat. The other ones have been taken away. And the values in its different positions, x, y, and z, is 1, 2, and 3, just as we expected. So that's great. But what if I wanted to get hold of these values and stick them perhaps in another property? So if I were to have another U property, which is marked as edit anywhere, so we can see it in the inspector, of type float, called myX, and we'll default this to 0 just so that we can see that we're changing it. And what I want to do is grab the x value from the myFloat in begin play, and I want to set it in the myX variable. So let's go over to the C++ file, and in begin play, after the line that says super begin play, we're going to set myX equal to what? We want to get something from my vector, but we don't want the whole of my vector. That would be an error. We can't set a vector into a float. We just want the x part of that vector. Well, to understand that, we need to understand the concept of an operator. Operators are symbols in C++ that do something. we've seen a few already. We've seen the plus operator, which adds two things together. There's also a minus operator. There's the equality operator, the equals operator, which assigns things. So we're using this right here on line 19. That's an operator that is assigning the value of my vector to my x. And then we have one more operator, which we need to get to know, which is the dot operator. It is an operator that gets something from within a struct or class. So we want to get the x from within my vector. So we use a dot operator. We do dot x. Now we don't use a space here between the my vector and the x. We just leave these run together like so. That's how we typically leave things, even though it isn't necessarily an error to put spaces in. So we've got my vector dot x should get the x value of the vector and put it into the my x float. So we put semicolon at the end of the line there. And as usual, I'm ignoring the red squigglies because sometimes they take a long time to update and sometimes they aren't correct. And then we're going to go into live coding and hit the button that recompiles and just check whether we get a successful outcome. And no, you see we've got a build failure. And if you look at the error, it's saying my vector is an undeclared identifier. And that's because I've made a typo. I've called the f vector a my float, and you're probably screaming at your screens, but it's good to show you that even experienced programmers make mistakes. We wanted to call that my vector, so I'm going to go back to the header file and rename it to my vector, which should remove the problem in my brain. Let's go ahead and click the compile button again, and that just gives you a taste of what it's like when you make errors. You get a compilation error. It happens all the time. In fact, it's very rare to not make mistakes the first time you do something. Then we're going to go ahead and hit play, and we'll see what value we get in the details pane. You can see now my x has been set to 1 because that was the value in the x component of the my vector variable. So I'd like to challenge you to set a vector value. We've been getting values from the vector. Now let's try setting them. Basically, try using the dot operator to set a value. Try flipping the two sides of that equals so that we have the my x on the right and the my vector over on the left instead. And what if you change it over to y or z? Is there any difference there? Pause the video and have a go. Okay, welcome back. So I'm going to have a go at flipping these two around. Let's go over to the C++ and in begin play. Instead, what I'm going to say is my vector dot y is equal to my x, and then put a semicolon at the end of the line. And this is how we can set values within a struct as well. So let's go back over into Unreal and recompile. And then we can go ahead and set some value in my x. So I'm going to put the value of 5 in here. Then I'm going to go ahead and play and have a look at the details pane for the moving platform. And sure enough, the y value of my vector has been updated in begin play by the value in my x. So congratulations, we have seen how to use more complicated types that are compound types like structs in C++. I will see you in the next lecture.